Hey, thank you so much for watching, listening today. We're continuing our series on seeing Jesus, knowing Jesus, expanding who Jesus is in our lives. And we've been talking about the Samaritan woman in the last episode. We talked about Jesus as a healer, as provider in the first episode. And today I want us to think about something that's really interesting to me. I read this a couple days ago and it really caught my attention. And it's from Mark chapter 6, verse 3. And it says this. Well, let me just read it as far as context. What's going on is Jesus has come back to his hometown and he's giving talking in the synagogue and teaching. And it says, when the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue and many listeners were astonished, saying, where did this man get these things? And what is the wisdom given to him and such miracles that he performed by his hands? So this is his hometown. This is like Jesus gets up in church and starts to give a sermon. But the problem is, it's his hometown. It's his own church/synagogue. So these are people that have seen him day in and day out. They recognize that's little Jesus who ran around the streets and, had a slingshot and would play whatever, goof off games, and rough and tumble with buddies around, that's Jesus. And the problem here is, in verse 3, this is what it says, Mark chapter 6, verse 3. The people in his hometown said, is this not the carpenter? That's the guy that's a carpenter. This is the son of Mary, the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon. And his sisters are here with us. And what happens is, there's a familiarity with Jesus. And I want us to think about this. A lot of times, especially if we've been raised in church and we have a lot of background, Sunday school, all that stuff, sometimes Jesus can be very common, familiar, and we think we know him, right? That's what these people said in his hometown. We think we know this guy. He's the dude down the street, the carpenter. Remember he made that chair for you? Oh, yeah. Remember that? Yeah, that was him too. He's the carpenter dude. And what happens is, if we're not careful, we get so familiar and comfortable with common Jesus that we can sometimes pigeonhole him and paint him into this corner, and he's not fully who he really is because of our constricted perspective. And when you read this, it's a little sad because as Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, everybody sees him as the common dude that we grew up with. We know him. We know his family. We know all about him. He's not anybody special. And what happens is this, Jesus responds and says to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives, his own household. And it says in verse 5, he could do no miracles there except that he laid his hands on a few people and healed them. And he wondered at their unbelief. I find it interesting. I think sometimes when we pigeonhole Jesus, we have this constrictive, confined, very handcuffed identity of who Jesus is, what Jesus does, and how he speaks. And that's what happened in his hometown. They had a very constricted, handcuffed, very limited perspective on who is Jesus. And because they grew up with him, because they were familiar, he was common, they didn't see him in the potential of who he fully, really, totally was at that time. They only saw him in this little narrow niche. And because of their limited perception, and it's a choice they made, it's their own decision, but because of that, it says here that he could not do hardly any miracles, and he marveled at their unbelief. And I think if we're not careful, I speak to myself, some of us who have been raised in church, we have this, educated definition of this is Jesus. This is who he is and this is what he does. And that's it. No more, no less. But I wonder if Jesus wouldn't like to kind of broaden your perspective. I think sometimes for some of us, we grew up in a charismatic environment. And so Jesus is all of the miracles and the signs and wonders and demonstrations and all that stuff. But we don't necessarily see him in terms of theological depth or some of that idea of sin and going out into a more unconverted world, sometimes we're limited. Sometimes maybe we grew up in more denominational background, so we see Jesus in theological terms. We see Jesus in kind of these spiritual deals, or we might go out in the world and do charitable, noble works. That's great. I think it's fantastic. But maybe we neglect to see Jesus as our healer, as the supernatural, as the miracle worker. Well, he did that 2,000 years ago, and that's kind of over. That era is finished. I think if we limit Jesus, this is what his hometown did. They limited their perception of who Jesus is. And Jesus would like to go beyond what your perception limits are for him. Are you willing to expand that Jesus could be more than what you possibly think, or more than what you have possibly experienced up to this point? I think sometimes we question and wrestle. We're like, well, I haven't experienced Jesus in these ways, so that must not be true. I think we have to be careful with that, because even though we may not experience Jesus in certain ways, doesn't mean that's not who he really is. It just means we have limited experience. And you can ask, well, why is that? I don't know. I think that's a Jesus question. You could ask Jesus, why? How come I haven't experienced you in these other ways? Maybe miracles, maybe provisions. How come you didn't do this, Jesus? I think these are all natural, normal questions. It would be good for you to ask and wrestle and kind of have conversations with Jesus about this. Because I'd rather have the wrestle and the conversations than the constricted, familiar, common constrictions that his hometown had. Because I think when we do that, then we neglect to see and experience the fullness, the potential of all of who Jesus is. And so this is a question I'd ask you to think about. How would you like to see or experience Jesus? In what ways in your life would you like to see and or experience Jesus? Just answer that. You're like, woof, I want everything. Well, get specific. List one thing. In what way would you like to see or experience Jesus? And of course, thank you for subscribing. Hit that little notification bell, because we'll keep you posted when we put up new content. And here is our fantastic joke. We know, fantastic in the loose sense of the word. What do you call a woman who is really good at darts? Her name is Amy. I know, right? You let. Okay, but next episode will be fantastic. Thanks again.